Hello again folks, and this is another screencast on the Sport and Society syllabus of the OCR specification. And for this particular screencast we're going to be talking about 20th century Britain, so the time frame between 1900 roughly to 1999. The general characteristics of this time frame can be summarised in these 6 boxes. We had the advent of scientific and technological innovation. So you had the introduction of the motor car, development of aeroplanes for transport. You had the advent of television in the 50s and 60s. You had the internet by the end of the 1900s, Tim Berners-Lee in 1989. And so lots of development of technological systems happened in this time period. Societies became rich, but wealth was not shared equally. That means the upper class and the middle class generally got richer, the rich got richer, and the poor generally got poorer. So there was a big divide into how this money was shared out between society. We had a huge growth in urbanisation, so lots of people were moving to cities. Spaces became a little bit more cramped in terms of living conditions. In terms of people moving to flats other than houses, etc. And there is this rapid growth of cities and structures at this time frame. Communications technology made great advances. So things like mobile phones, telephones, as we mentioned before, the internet. So the communication industry has a rapid rise. By the very end of this century, we had more time for leisure. Leisure time was something that was introduced around about sort of late 1990s, and therefore working hours started to reduce towards what we see now between 36 hours a week for a standard working week, as well as paid sick leave, holiday time. These sorts of things were starting to occur in this time frame. And eventually we also had this introduction of terrorism between the 60s and 70s. Lots of terrorist attacks in terms of aeroplanes, and then that's gradually introduced in society in terms of different forms of terrorism. So that affected people's mental well-being, as well as obviously the stress of the terror activities themselves. Of course, we've still got to apply all of our social cultural characteristics that you see on this screen to this time frame. So we're going to start by doing these particular ones that are on this screen, which will help you with your study. So let's start with law and order. By 1900, games had become much more formalised. So we had a few things put in place. We had some written rules for certain sports. So codified games were generally formalised in the late 1800s, but you now had set written rules that were properly standardised. You had a code of conduct introduced for players and also now for spectators on how to behave when watching games. So it was something new that was brought in. You had a regular fixture list so people could understand when games were being played, who they were playing against. It was much more formal and structured. You had a boundary line outside a pitch, even at local parks, so spectators could come and watch. And in bigger clubs, you had stadiums start to be built, all-seater stadiums, eventually by the end of the century. But initially, these were standing places behind a boundary line, so spectators could come and watch. You also had the disappearance, mainly, of cruel and violent games. And added to this idea of law and order, we had safety equipment developed for certain sports, such as boxing. Gloves were introduced. By the end of that century, padded helmets were introduced for certain sports. So we had lots of safety aspects brought in regards to rules and structure of games. Paid spectatorism also developed in terms of people could now pay for a ticket to watch a game. This brought revenue in for local clubs. Just a quick note before I move on from this slide. Hunting had not been banished in any way because it was still an upper class sport. It was their society, they had free time, they thought they could do what they wanted to in terms of their fox hunting, and that's probably still why it remains today in terms of the class association. So as I mentioned a minute ago, spectatorism started to develop. Often it involved a fee to pay to go and watch a particular team or particular club. With the addition of the train and the development of the motor car, and eventually the development of planes, spectators could then travel around the country to watch specific games. And this rapidly led to a massive rise in spectatorism, particularly for the working class. Initially, there were a lot more people watching the game than playing the game, because it was quite cheap and effective to go and watch sport. But as professionalism grew, and we'll talk about that later on, there will be an increase in number of professional sports players by the end of the century. But spectatorism was massive. Of course, the added advantage now is, with the Saturday half day introduced last century, regular games on Saturdays were played. This led to more regular games, certainly by the end of the century, sort of late 1990s, when Sky introduced football leagues. Games were then played much more often rather than on just the festival day as we'd had it in previous centuries. So that was Law and Order, and that should cover you for a lot of the exam questions on Law and Order. Let's move on to class. Class in this time frame were split into working class, of course, the middle class and the upper class. But the most effects we can see are between the working class and the middle class in this time frame. So we'll start with the working class. Pubs were massively associated with sports. The working class individual could go to a local pub, they could watch sport or bet on sport. So we had this idea of drinking, gambling, sport all connecting together. This led to certain sports being much more popular for the working class. Horse racing, boxing, rugby league in the north, less so in the south, football, snooker, darts. We also had sports such as cricket, where the amateurs and professionals would still play together, so that would still be associated with working class, particularly in the summer months. Now, what we say about the working class at this point in time, in this period, that they participated. So they generally were the participants of sports, or they were associated, if they were working within the sports industry, with a paid role, such as a groundkeeper or a gameskeeper, or they could be the kit man. They'd be associated with a lower class role with that sport or participating in sport. Of course, wagering was still a massive thing that connected sport with the working class, and it was absolutely essential in terms of the development of sport. So more wagering meant more money put into that sport, therefore that working class sport could develop. The thing you need to remember here, though, were that the working class still had less money, they still had less time, but what free time they had, they would go to the pub or enjoy these particular sporting activities. What this led to, as well as the increased spectatorism, was that the idea of professionalism increased. So the working class were still the professionals, same as the last century. And clubs could now afford to pay more professionals and get more working class involved because the spectators were paying money. And so this idea of professionalism started to accelerate, particularly for the working class, and it gave them an opportunity into sport. Added to that, over this time frame, more interest became in sport for the working class, and so they needed to know news about it. They were interested in that. So sports press developed, radio, newspapers. sports sections in a newspaper would have started to develop certainly between the mid to end of this century, and the working class would read this stuff, and so therefore it accelerated their interest in sport. As I mentioned before, cricket was still the sport where both classes played together, and if you could only be cricket captain of England if you were an amateur, right up until the early 1960s, that was still the case. So the idea of the amateurism and professionalism issue was still there. Now, in terms of the middle class, it's not on this slide, but if you can make a note as to what I'm saying here, the middle class would play sports such as golf, polo, cricket, tennis. They were common sports that they were played because they had a little bit more time, a little bit more money. Often that involved longer time frame, duration in terms of activity, but also it required individual coaching such as tennis, so you needed a bit more money to do that, or equipment such as polo, horses, etc. The upper class would also play some of these sports, but of course they had their own time to do what they will. They had a lot of money to pay for equipment and play different sports. Generally speaking, as I mentioned before, the working class were the performers, or they'd have a lower paid role. However, the middle class became promoters. So they might attend a boxing event, but generally speaking they wouldn't get involved in it, but they promote it. So there'd be an organiser, they'd stump up the money for working class fighters to have a boxing match. The middle class and the upper class technically were still amateurs. That's very important to note down. And therefore they got drawn to games such as cricket, Olympic activities such as athletics, because it still showed that amateur ethos and that idea of playing for the enjoyment of something rather than being paid for it. And the reason they could be amateurs is because they had more free time and more disposable income. The World Wars had a big impact on money and the class system. Sport was a real morale booster during World War I, and games were continued to play during World War I in certain sports. However, the middle class didn't like that aspect. They frowned upon why people were spending their time spectating particular sports when really we should be looking towards the war effort and doing things to help ourselves in terms of the war. So it's very frowned upon. After the war, in terms of World War I and World War II, society suffered massively in terms of economy, and there was big depression, less money to go around, which meant people had less income to spend on sport as well as their free time, of course, when they went back to work. And so the effects on sport were quite dramatic after the wars, so it suffered. Especially in the north or factory towns, clubs in those industrial regions might have gone bankrupt because they couldn't afford to pay the professional wage bill, or they couldn't afford certain infrastructure to keep the club running, and it was a very difficult time for some clubs after the World Wars. So some clubs folded. Last thing on class really, you can see here, this is the new class system in this time frame. So we've gone from working class, middle class, upper class. We've now got this sort of structure that's on the screen, but it's now much more complicated. You're not necessarily middle class if you were a factory owner. It depended on your role within the factory. Were you the manager of the factory? Were you the casual worker at the factory? It would depend more on the role that you're doing in terms of which class structure you fitted into. And before we finish on class, just a final note to say the unemployed had real trouble playing sport at this time, and it really affected those because they couldn't afford to spectate and they couldn't afford to play. So they didn't have much money at all. Moving on then to the factor of gender. As a rule of thumb, in terms of the century, the participation of females in sporting activity had declined by the start of that century in the 1900s. So we still had some lawn tennis going on at the start of 1900s, but the participation generally had fallen back in society. And reasons for that were that in this century, the attitude towards females from males was that they should be staying at home, looking after children, associated with cleaning and cooking and domestic chores. They weren't expected to marry like the previous century, but they were still expected to bear children and look after those children, look after the household. So they certainly weren't expected to play any sport. It was still a man's game. Therefore, females working all of the time, especially working class females, and looking after the home, had much less time for sport, let alone money around to play or develop sport. Middle class females had more time, and so they might start to take an interest in certain activities such as athletics, cricket, outdoor pursuits, certainly by the end of the century. So it's the middle class in this century that had a little bit more opportunity than males, but it was still very male dominated. Very few women indeed would have been spectators. It was not seen to be spectating at a football match in the 70s or the 60s. It was very male orientated, which I'll come on to in a minute. It was only the real end of the century where certain sports were starting to accelerate. All-seater stadiums had come in. Therefore, families might go to watch games at the very, very end of the century. So we're talking 1990s, where that started to change. But the majority of that century, females very rarely spectated at sport. What that meant overall is that working class women were excluded from professional sport. They were permitted to enter things like the Olympics, but the opportunity for working class women was so low or so little because of time and money that they just didn't participate or didn't think they could achieve anything in terms of professional identity. Now, as I mentioned, it was male-dominated sport in this time period, and that was certainly no more associated than the sport of football. Crowds to watch football and rugby league in the north became very male, white, working class crowds, and it became a common thing. Saturday afternoon, the white working class males would flock to the football, flock to the rugby league, flock to the local pubs, flock to gamble. So these things all became embroiled together. And as I mentioned earlier, the unemployed and unskilled, so people who had poor paid jobs, couldn't afford to spectate at this time frame. What occurred, certainly within the 70s, due to the political unrest of the mining strikes and other factors, depression, it meant that hooliganism started to occur at certain games because there was such a male-dominated crowd. You had things occurring in stadia where fights were common, gangs started to develop in terms of particular supportive gangs would go looking around for other white working class opposing fans and causing trouble. And it was all over the television and all over the press. Added to that, you had two disasters that happened within stadia. So you had the Bradford fire disaster and you had the Hillsborough disaster. And the net effect of that eventually meant that in the late 80s, after the Hillsborough disaster, stadium then developed to all-seater stadium, and that's when the white working class male only dominated crowd started to filter out, because then we start to have families introduced to stadia because they could come and sit down, and football and rugby league were trying to encourage that sort of aspect by the end of the century. So it's sort of changed, but for the majority of the century it was mainly male, white working class supporters. This all connects in with time, and I guess it connects to money. As we mentioned, all this screencast, working class individuals, females and males, time and money were restricted generally across the board. Margaret Thatcher decided to close the pits, so the miners. That meant many were unemployed and had a lack of money or resources. Games became quite limited in this time period, and what happened was the pub culture in which the males were associated with led to a rise in particular sports because money was so poor, and time, due to the unemployed, meant they had a little bit more time to sit down and play some certain games. So games developed such as darts, dominoes, billiards, snooker, all because of that lack of time and money, and they were easy games you could sit around the pub with other working class individuals, and those games could be played. Strikes were common at this point in time, as we mentioned before, because of the pit closures and the mining closures. Hooliganism was rife at sporting events, and all this added up to mean that most working class individuals had little time, little energy, and little money for sport itself. By the very end of the 1990s, we had something introduced called leisure time, and this came about through a period of events that slowly meant time and money were changing for the working class. The main event that changed a lot of this was the fact that Labour had become back into power in government after a long period away. So you had Tony Blair become Prime Minister, and it meant more money was introduced to the working class and to the country as a whole. We had events at that time. In terms of football, we had the Euro 96 held here in England. We had Sport England develop and allow more funding for sports. As I mentioned before, we had this idea of leisure time. So leisure centres were introduced where people could go to a gym and have a workout in their free time. And this became quite a common and fashionable thing to do, to go to a leisure centre and have a workout. This also had a knock-on effect. This increased time and money on sport directly in terms of participation rates started to increase. People started playing sport as a whole again. And spectatorism increased because people had a little bit more money in their pocket. Okay, so that is in effect a bit of a broad stroke in terms of how those factors are affecting this particular time frame. So I'd like you again to draw a timeline activity for this particular screencast. This time you're going to split it in two again, but you're going to have different time frames. So you're going to have 1900 to 1999, thinking about the first half and the second half again. And what I'd like you to do is look at the next two slides. So you'll have to pause each one and find out what happened in terms of where they sit in terms of the first half and the second half, and add them to your time frame. So you've got a sense of what's going on. The issue with this century is 1900 to 1970, things were very, very tight economically and in terms of time for most people. After around about 1990, things have changed. So only for a 10-year period did things actually change. But generally, time and money were the biggest influencers on this century in terms of what actually happened. So here are the grids to help you out. Okay, once again, thanks for watching. And again, if you need any more help on any particular aspect of OCR A-Level PE, please pop over to the iSpeakpe channel on YouTube.